Chapter 1540 Their Turn. Alara bounded into Silas's embrace like a tiny, tenacious koala clinging ever tighter. Had she been any smaller, he could easily picture her joyfully wrapping herself around his head, since even now, she had jumped so high that her legs curled around his triceps instead of his waist. Silas shook his head with a quiet smile as he caught her. Seeing her like this was all the confirmation he needed that his family was thriving. Not that there was much doubt of that. Once Silas assumed control of the Golden Grove, he had woven a network of connections between his domain and his father-in-law, the memory merchant, and his own father. This triumvirate coordinated closely, steadily narrowing the gap between Earth and the vast beyond so that the divide was no longer as daunting as it once seemed. In fact, this alliance had brought surprising benefits to the Golden Grove. Earth's evolutionary phase, and the Grove's status as a summoned world, meant it generated an abundance of rare and valuable items. Both his father and father-in-law were savvy enough to discern what should be transferred and what ought to remain concealed. They carefully funneled resources to the Grove that were a notch or two above the usual standard, ensuring the gift was substantial but never overwhelming. At the same time, with Silas firmly at the helm, the Golden Grove had no incentive to betray his family, creating a stable and trustworthy partnership. Besides, with the enormous profits Silas had amassed through his wages, even without his relatives' contributions, how could anyone rationally betray the golden goose for a mere golden egg? The contract Silas had sealed with the memory merchant, all those years ago when he first trapped the enigmatic figure in a binding deal, also paid dividends. Because of that pact, the city enjoyed unprecedented access to a vast array of skills and gene skills. And this was before factoring in Nathan and the legacy left by Archibald. Old Brahma had already familiarized the Golden Grove with mechatronics and related branches of rune mastery, making Nathan the ideal ally for them. Although Nathan's rank was still within the F tier, his profession came by chance through Archibald, a man who had conquered the Split Realm and ranked just below Silas himself. Archibald had long held first place on a seemingly insurmountable legendary dungeon. While Silas didn't know the exact nature of Nathan's profession, he was certain it was top tier, significant enough that Archibald deemed it indispensable to bequeath it before his demise. Old Brahma could well be the mentor Nathan needed, but it was also likely that Brahma himself would gain more from the arrangement than Nathan would. Yet, as seamless and promising as their progress had been, it now felt as though everything was on the verge of shattering. All right, Alara, let your brother go. No, Alara responded firmly without sparing a glance. Isolde appeared slightly helpless. Grey strands had crept into her hair, but an inner light still marked her smile, a testament to a life suffused with quiet contentment. It simply wasn't the flawless life she had envisioned. SS Novelfire net. Silas could never recall a time when his parents didn't place kin above career or ambition. They had prospered, sure, but could have easily become just another pair of billionaires competing with Grimblade heirs if they had sacrificed the principles they clung to. Though her life was peaceful, Isolde resented the long stretches without seeing her son. She understood he needed to carve out his own path eventually, but having cherished having him home daily for 26 years left her spoiled. Now, separated for so long, she felt as if a vital piece of herself was missing. And she wasn't sure when her little girl would be ready to step into the world beyond their home. Alara might have been a mirror image of Silas, if not for her brighter, wilder spirit. But a mother knows her children best. There was a latent restlessness deep within both Silas and Alara, a hunger that, once sparked, left them insatiable. Silas had long wrestled with boredom until finally encountering something that stirred him enough to pursue it relentlessly. Alara was somewhat shielded from such restlessness, sheltered beneath Silas's protective shadow. She adored her brother and harbored no wish to compete with him. But what if that changed? Seated in their opulent living room, living a life fit for royalty while most others on Earth struggled merely to survive this brutal, survival of the fittest era. Isolde felt as though the delicate balance holding her perfect family together might collapse at any moment. Tears welled up as she watched the siblings cling to each other, knowing deep down that the past was already out of reach. Chaosheir slipped silently to Isolde's side and enveloped her in a tight embrace. The two women said nothing, but shared an unspoken understanding of Silas's fate. "It'll be all right," Chaosheir whispered. "He'll make sure of it." Isolde forced a smile, eyes shimmering with sorrow. She did not want her son to bear that burden alone. Had it been her husband, she might have found it easier to accept, but even then, she wished neither of them to face such a weight. Perhaps selfish, but all she longed for was for the world and its dangers to leave them in peace. Why couldn't things revert to the way they were before? She also understood exactly how Silas would answer that hope. The peace they had known was possible only because their ancestors had fought tooth and nail for it. Now the torch passed to them. It was their time to fight. Chapter 1541 already knew. How are you progressing with your rune mastery? Silas inquired, glancing at his younger sister. Alara scrunched her face. It's tedious. I don't get why you're so obsessed with this stuff. Since when did you think I was obsessed? Silas countered. You just keep pushing me toward the things you enjoy. Why can't you be interested in something more exciting? I don't look like someone eager to jog endless miles. I'm a delicate young lady, after all. Silas chuckled softly but shook his head. She was nearly 15, perhaps it was natural for her to start speaking this way now. Still, he preferred not to dwell on that thought. Just give me a straight answer. Alara sighed dramatically and rolled her eyes. It's going all right. She lifted her hand, and a rune materialized. Silas noted the rune had 50 foundations and swiftly coalesced into Vitality Mastery. Given how lethargic she seemed, there was clearly more potential untapped. How close are you to reaching Spark Mastery? Alara gave a lazy shrug. I could probably get there. But I don't like how undefined it feels. Like something's missing. Silas nodded thoughtfully. From her words, he understood she had already sensed the threshold of Spark Mastery. Likely, she could have crossed it any time she chose but preferred to deepen her understanding first. Her cautious approach reminded Silas of how he might behave if afforded that luxury. His own days were a constant battle for survival. Ironically, despite facing one of his greatest challenges ahead, this moment was the most tranquility he had enjoyed in ages. Compared to him, Alara had access to all the knowledge and materials he had passed down. She had methodically built a solid rune mastery foundation, while he was often forced to make perilous, solitary leaps into unknown territory. By the time he reached the sanctum, even his mentor could no longer guide him, though Silas would never claim Grelith hadn't played a crucial role. Instead of pressing with a direct question, Silas shifted gears. What would make rune mastery enjoyable for you? Alara blinked, surprised by his query, then a playful smile tugged at her lips. Food. She exclaimed as if a brilliant idea had just struck her. What do you think? Could I conjure a cake out of thin air? Her eyes quickly darted to Silas, silently pleading for him to say yes. Silas paused, considering. Probably, but even I can't manage that yet. Cake required several organic ingredients. He could easily create inorganic items, but eggs, milk, flour, oil. At best, he could form some water. He stood quietly as his thoughts shifted like flickering flames. Interestingly, Alara seemed lost in her own reflections too, a gentle weave of ether swirling around them. Just then, Magnus and Cedric burst into the room, having finally returned. Magnus, Silas' grandfather, appeared youthful, looking no older than 40 now. His aura radiated power, surpassing everyone in the family, already reaching level 50. He was on the verge of completing his foundation and beginning the ascent to level 51, entering the esteemed E grade. It was said that if not for the unexpected return to Origin, Magnus might have already started that progression. Instead, he now faced vast untapped potential that needed to be awakened first. Magnus was aware that Silas had instructed all to wait at level 0, yet he spent his life anticipating the summoning. Not everyone was content to passively await Silas raising their levels. He was a man with pride. Having lost his wife, protecting his lineage was all that remained to him. As for Cedric, Silas noted his robust health. Though his aura wasn't as profound as Magnus, the sharp clarity and resolute determination in his eyes were unmistakable. Silas didn't need any words to understand that if Cedric had to fight, he would do so without hesitation. And that knowledge was a soothing balm. Cedric opened his mouth to speak but was cut off by Magnus, who sensed something was amiss between Silas and Alara at that moment. Then Casray's parents entered, Geraldine rushing over to embrace her daughter tightly. The room trembled as the surge of ether intensified. Gradually, Silas' own aura dimmed while Alara's brightened fiercely. Silas instinctively stepped back, regaining focus as he observed his sister's energy blossom. Back at the rune tower, Silas had once aided Gwennu in elevating her rune mastery to a new echelon. The technique he used bordered on hypnotic influence, though it wasn't truly hypnosis. His unique ability to operate within the fourth dimension allowed him to overlay what felt like an endless layer of runes upon the third-dimensional plane. Technically, this wasn't infinite but a superposed conjuredbywords, a realm of infinite possibilities condensing into a singular path once observed. While Gwennu couldn't fully grasp the fourth dimension as Silas did, her vague insights gave her an instinctual sense of direction. Silas could easily discern Gwennu's chosen path. But his sister's path was far more intricate. A form of rune mastery rooted in organic origins. Silas had never encountered one before and had to begin theorizing a potential course himself. Until Alara discovered a thread she could comprehend. Suddenly, Silas Primus Luminaria title shimmered violently, making him almost laugh. It seemed uncertain which of the two it wished to follow. Latest content published on novelfire.net. Silas already knew the answer. Chapter 1542 Legacy of the Dogons. His Primus Luminaria contested title settled down as his sister slowly regained her focus. She blinked for a moment, looking around, and then pouted. I still can't summon a cake. This sucks. Silas shook his head. His sister clearly didn't care very much for rune mastery. Though, there was no denying that this path had quite some potential. If Silas backtracked and found a path similar to this one instead all those months ago, he had a feeling that he would have comprehended how to draw legendary genes long ago. Silas was more interested in the nitty-gritty of runes, the very foundation of it all, what made the world tick. It wasn't about organic or inorganic to him, it was about casting the strongest runes there were. His sister didn't care to chase after something like that. She just liked her sweets. And even that couldn't be said to be something she cared a great deal about, it was just good enough for her. Silas just thought about teaching her his own path. But he knew enough about rune mastery now to know that following someone else's path would never allow you to reach the perfect spark mastery. While this wasn't ideal, it was at least good enough to make his contested title move, which meant that his sister's talent was good enough to take seriously. You're slacking, Silas said. Alara only pouted more. I should be getting ready for my first homecoming, not whatever this is. Well, life isn't always fair. Alara stuck her tongue out but didn't reply. 1918. In the end, Silas could only shake his head. His little sister really was too much like him. The difference was their outward personality, but their fundamental underlying lens through which they saw the world was one for one. The only people the two of them didn't care to compete with were one another. Silas had said many times before that his sister was smarter than himself. But was that true, or was that just because he couldn't be bothered to figure out who was superior between the two of them and just decided to hand the title of smartest to her? By the same token, could Alara be bothered to try very hard if her brother was already handling everything? Who was she going to compete with? Him. Why? To prove what to who, exactly? That was why she chose her rune mastery path based on what would make her life most convenient. Maybe there was a smarter, more clever choice to make. She just didn't care. Silas held up a palm. Ether swirled around it, and a gene formed from thin air, resplendent and golden, blinding to the eyes of anything without rune mastery on a high enough level. When you were at Silas' level, though, you didn't just see gold. You saw what felt almost like quantum unfolding, radiant, silky lines of silvery rainbow colors folding into and out of one another. Alara blinked as she looked at it, not blinded at all. Is that a legendary gene? She eventually asked. Yes. And you can just make one out of thin air. That's right. Alara blinked again. Everything can be made by runes. Everything. Alara held her hand up, and lines began to form across her skin, changing and morphing as though trenches were being carved into it. But given her expression, it didn't seem to hurt at all. Why did Silas love rune mastery so much? Ever since he was young, he had been obsessed with puzzles of all sorts. He only stopped playing with them because they stopped being intellectually stimulating. To him, runes felt like the ultimate puzzle, the ultimate challenge to grasp, comprehend, and figure out. There was nothing he enjoyed more. But while he and his sister looked at the world the same way, their hobbies, their passions, their desires for their lives weren't the same. If Alara had been born during Scylla's Lego phase, she would have probably pointed and laughed at him for wasting his time on something like that. To her, puzzles, Legos, and things of that nature weren't real. Where was the satisfaction in figuring them out? She found much more enjoyment out of figuring people out. When she joked with her brother about finding him a girlfriend that would get him thrown under the jail, of course that was in most part a joke, but it was also out of curiosity. Did her brother like girls? If he did, why was he always alone? Did he prefer to be alone? Why? She never really treated her brother himself like a puzzle, but some of the most fun she had had in the last 2 years was tricking the Grimblade teachers into thinking she was incompetent while learning the most from them at the same time. But then she had been taken away from those classes again and tossed into normal schooling once more, and it went back to being boring. Fundamentally, she understood that rune mastery formed everything, and everything linked back to rune mastery. But it wasn't until she saw that gene before her that it truly clicked. It felt like the difference between innately comprehending an open secret and truly grasping it. Suddenly, golden hair burst across Alara's skin, the aura of a monkey king radiating violently in all directions. She grasped at the air, and runes swirled into a staff, claws extending from her slender fingers until they wrapped around it. Silas watched in silence, understanding what he was seeing, and watching intently nonetheless. He could feel an explosion in her strength until her eyes dimmed, waves of fatigue hitting her until it all vanished. Her arm returned to its original state as the shaking in Silas Primus Luminaria title calmed once more. It seemed his sister had taken the flesh mastery the Dogons had been so proud of to another level. Controlling your bones was nice and all. But what if you could extend that level of control to every layer? Chapter 1543 The Grimblades. Well done, Silas said simply. In the distance, Kasari blinked, looking towards Silas' back as the latter was entirely focused on his little sister. Never in her life had she ever heard Silas praise anyone. Anyone. It quite literally didn't matter who. Refine it. I think you can craft a unique gene around it that's superior to the Dogons. If your spark mastery becomes deep enough, you can deviate from the current human simioid race you have down another path. Alara shook her head. I don't want to be a monkey. And that Monkey King guy is an arsehat. I want nothing to do with him unless you beat him up. Watch your mouth, young lady. Startled, Isolde immediately began to scold her daughter, but Alara just as quickly hid behind Silas for protection. Silas smiled lightly and rubbed her head. You can be whatever you want. The potential is limitless. The Dogons' ability to utilize their rune mastery to control their bones, extending them into both weapons and defense, was quite extraordinary. While on the surface this ability didn't sound impressive, the more Silas learned about rune mastery, the more he understood the depths of abilities one could unlock with such a path. They were essentially in full control over their own bone essence. They could add strength to it, manipulate it, change and form it to their will. This was essentially like gaining extrication to the depths of the bone essence layer, by proxy giving you unilateral control over blood essence, gene talents, and genes all at once. Of course, only bone essence control came naturally to them, while only those that awakened had the potential to go further and parlay this into extended control over the other layers, like a certain Dogon had done after evolving post-battle with Silas. But even so, when things were laid out this way, it was considerably more impressive. For context, the Viridorn that was so very feared by Fowler also had such an ability. It was just that they had this same control over their blood essence. Bone essence was a layer deeper than blood essence. That was to say that the Dogons, should they have reached their full potential, would have been more fearsome than even the B+ race Viridorn. And now, Alara was unlocking a rune mastery path that could potentially allow her to go even beyond bone essence in this control. Just now, she had tapped into her race quintessence itself, which was the deepest layer there was outside of free chaos and potential. Of course, she had only done so superficially, and she was only controlling a power she already had within her body. But if it kept growing like this, the sky was the limit. It was no wonder his Primus Luminaria contested title had second-guessed him again. Truthfully, Silas didn't care whether he had the title or not. Its greatest use was in suppressing all rune masters he came across regardless of grade. But there was, unfortunately, fine print to this. This ability was only most effective on those from his sector. When he came across those of other sectors, how effective the suppression would be dependent on how, like, the laws of the sector were. And if the sector was of a much higher level, he could forget about suppressing anyone from it. Of course, there was also the ability to cast runes of a higher grade than his tier. Because of it, he could draw E-grade rune armor. But that was kind of overblown and unnecessary as well. The difficulty of doing so at the F tier was still so high it was almost more worthwhile for Silas to focus on improving his F tier armor to greater and greater levels instead. For example, the Ape Emperor armor he had drawn while he was trying to get his race to A grade was far more powerful than the combined F and E grade Scorpion Warlord armor he had. The one that he had drawn based on the Monkey King. The rightful source is novlfire.net. Well, that one made his Scorpion Warlord armor look like a joke. And it was entirely F tier. But in the end, the Primus Luminaria contested title had chosen to stay with him. Do you have a better one for me? Alara asked with bright eyes. Silas thought for a moment. If his sister didn't like the human simioid path, was there something else he could give her? What don't you like about the Monkey King? I want to punch his face. Silas smiled again. He understood that it wasn't the path his sister didn't like, but wanting to rush ahead to punch the Monkey King in the face would basically mean that she was competing with him, something she preferred not to have to do. So, she wanted another path instead. After a moment, Silas took out a large number of corpses, put them in a new spatial device, and handed them to his sister. Each and every one of these corpses was the result of an E-grade Dogon. Silas had lost count of the number of their corpses he had, but because back when they were useful to him he had only had F-grade Vipermancy, and also because they had gene locks on their bodies, he couldn't do much of anything even after his Vipermancy became E-grade. However, despite them being E-grade, Silas' F-grade Reaper Sealright profession worked against them because the Dogons were a race of Earth. The fact they had gene locks in the first place was already a shock. However, the gene locks themselves were only of the F-grade, making it trivial for Silas to use the life seal to undo them. The life seal didn't actually directly allow for the undoing of gene locks. Instead, it only allowed Silas to place them. Silas assumed he would have to level it up to allow him to undo gene locks. But, Silas was the Primus Luminaria of the sector, a perfect spark master. When that was layered with his new perfected comprehension of genes, the moment he could use the life seal to sense them, he could use his own rune mastery to undo them even without the profession's help. In fact, it was trivial. Was it weird to give your sister a gift of dozens of corpses? Maybe for another family. But they were the Grimblades. Chapter 1544 Lose. Silas was inevitably scolded by his mother, a canon event he could only take in mostly silence, mixed in with a few words of affirmation. As for Alara, she seemed to have already scurried off with her new toys before Isolde could hope to take them away. In one part, Silas could clearly feel that while this seemed to be playing out like a joke, his mother was truly distraught by this. The life she hoped to return to was only being torn further and further from them, and there was nothing that she, as a mother, could do in hopes of changing it. But in another part, Silas knew that this was a band-aid that had to be ripped off. Quite frankly, for the same reasons Silas didn't care for his children to be powerful or not, he didn't care if his family was or wasn't either. Logically speaking, the more powerful they were, the better their chances at protecting themselves from threats. With the ways of this world, they were too weak, and unless he reached a truly untouchable point a day that was still too far away for now they would always be in danger. However, this was a bit of a paradox. If he wanted his family to be as powerful as they could be, they would have to inevitably put themselves in more danger, and that was unacceptable to him. This was his little sister, his mother, his father, his grandfather, his wife, and her parents. He would give them anything they needed, whenever they needed it. If it was up to him, they wouldn't have to work a single day. Kasari and his grandfather were just especially stubborn, so there would be no stopping them unless he forcefully held them against their will, something he had no intention of doing. But the others. What was the point of growing powerful if his family had to work just as hard as he did? The thought came with an almost odd clarity to Silas, a focus that wouldn't have been there unless he returned home. Until now, every time he thought of power, he thought of it in terms of himself, in terms of how powerful he would be in the future, in terms of how he didn't want others to control him or his path forward. But he had never explicitly stated that it was to protect those he cared for as well. That thought had always been there, like when he scoffed at the idea of the galaxy's saving progenitor status for his firstborn. Why would he give his child such a burden when he could take it on himself? How talented or untalented his children were didn't matter in the slightest to him outside of their health and their future. A thought that had always been there, and yet never quite explicitly understood until he stood across from the tear-stricken face of his mother. Isolde probably didn't even notice that she was crying. Her voice was steady, her reasoning fair. Alara was so young, she shouldn't have to see such things. She should be listening to teenage angst playlists and dreaming of her first love. She should be thinking about driving down a road for the first time and picking out a dress for homecoming. How did dissecting corpses fit into that? The tears began to fall from her eyes as though pulled out by grief she had yet to process or comprehend. It wasn't fair. It wasn't fair that her little girl had to go through such things, that her son had to put his life on the line every day in a world she still couldn't even begin to understand. Just this morning, she had tried to open her bedroom door, only to accidentally pull it off the hinges because of strength she didn't even know she had. Staring at the mirror, she looked 10 years younger for no reason, something that maybe should have made her happy, but only made her feel all the worse. It was unnatural. Everything was so very unnatural. She had been bottling it up for so long, reprimanding her son about treating women better and trying to keep their home tidy for when he finally returned. Never facing the fact that just because he did return didn't mean that it would change anything. And now he was here, he was finally back, in one piece, just as handsome as she remembered her little boy being. Almost as though she couldn't see his changes at all. Yet it was just the same. That same gut-sinking feeling, that same horrid sense of dread, that something terrible was coming, that they would never return to the life they had once had. Silas reached a thumb forward and wiped the tears from his mother's cheeks. "You don't have to worry, Mother," he said calmly, looking at her intently. The ring of gold around his once purely emerald irises seemed to blaze with its own light, so strong and radiant it practically illuminated the room more than even the beaming sun. "When have you ever known me to lose?" Isolde froze, her eyes flickering down to her son's palm. It was only now she seemed to notice her eyes had been practically leaking, soaking Sila's palm through. Her breathing hitched a bit as though a sob slumbering deep within her was threatening to pry its way back up. But she stabilized herself, quickly wiping at her face and standing tall. She smiled. "You're right, my baby boy doesn't lose." Silas nodded, maybe almost a little too seriously. "Be strong." It was something that he had known he had to chase from the very moment he stepped into this world. But why? It was all too obvious now. Not just to control his life, but to make sure those he cared for could control theirs. Madness, legendary, progenitor. The madness consumes you, but does not control you. Instead, it becomes your tool to both control yourself and others. You, while steeped in madness, maintain your wits about you. Your enemies, though, are not so lucky. Plus 10,000% charisma. Plus 10,000% will. Arcane Madness Will. Chapter 1545 Sin. The earth itself trembled. Storm clouds rolled overhead, the seas overturning in violent, tsunami-like waves. Mountains shook as though they might collapse, and the walls of valleys squeezed in on themselves as though intent on closing. Castlemaine and the City Lord mansion they stayed in couldn't have been calmer. Yet, to the rest of the world, it was like their time was coming to an end. And then it all came to a stop, Sila's hair falling to a resting position on his chest. "Congratulations, you have completed the journey of madness. Would you like to activate the madness system?" "Yes, no." Sila's eyes narrowed. The notification was particularly annoying. Usually, he could ignore it, but this one had appeared right in front of his mother's face as though it wouldn't allow him even the chance to look at her unless he made a choice first. The madness system. Didn't he already have a madness system? What was this supposed to be? And what was Arcane Madness Will? His will title itself hadn't changed, but this will seemed to have the title of a new will. Was it related? Something completely different? The system's inability to properly assess and understand will had led him down many confusing paths in the past. The fact he had demonic will on top of normal will only made it all the more complex. Silas was about to ask the little girl when he hesitated. His luck actually flickered. Odd. Silas' gaze suddenly flashed as he recalled something. A long while ago, he had gotten his hands on a technique known as arcane telekinesis. Much like everything else he had gotten, there was just so much potential in so many things to unearth that it was ultimately neglected. That said, it wasn't as though the existence of arcane telekinesis was make or break for Silas. Because of its existence, he had learned how to apply his telekinesis in many ways, and it was a large part of the reason he was able to bridge the weakness of his physical stats by using his telekinesis to compensate. Now, he had suddenly received his arcane madness will. Were they related? Silas looked at the notification hovering before him. Why did his luck not want him to ask the little girl? In the Milky Way galaxy, Silas' luck had effectiveness that was off the charts. It might as well be thousands of times larger here. On Earth specifically, it was even more exaggerated than that. His luck might read 4 digits right now, but the numbers were effectively empty. It might as well have been in the millions. His luck would never be sharper than it was here. Earth itself was practically taking the reins and telling him not to tell her. The problem was that the little girl was so attached to him that she could basically read his mind. Just the surface thoughts, but she could still do it. It was something that he had just been forced to get used to. Even if he didn't tell her, wouldn't the end result be the same? Silas' intent hovered over yes, but he didn't feel the same warning. Interesting. That said, when he hovered over no, he also didn't feel anything. Was it beyond his luck even here to understand? Or did the answer not matter? But if the answer didn't matter, why did it tell him not to ask the little girl? All right, show me. Silas returned to yes, and pushed it. A rush of ether formed around him, solidifying into something sparkling that hovered in the air, something all too familiar. Madness key, treasure. A key leading to a fortune of madness. Detects other madness disciples and enlightens your path. Contains small spatial world within. Can answer one question in exchange for less than one fragmented greater than gene, virtue status, prideful beacon. Suppress one less than common greater than challenge a day to maintain happiness. Requirements grow by the day. Less than 7 days greater than remaining until hunger increases. A second madness key took shape, gliding itself into place. However, while Silas' gluttony madness key had a worn rope attached to it, this new madness key was a thick golden chain, beaming and resplendent. It looked as though it had just been polished and was so gaudy that it was something Silas would simply never wear of his own accord. And yet, those thoughts only seemed to make the pride madness key more pleased. However, the moment it completely combined with Silas, it shook. The scorned wraps on Silas' body wrapped tighter around his wrists and ankles as though afraid of being completely expelled. Silas' gaze flickered. I can take him off. The realization hit him like a speeding truck. The more he learned about the universe, the more he understood just how shocking of a treasure these scorned wraps were. And yet, his pride madness key was actually capable of expelling it with a thought. Silas suppressed the intent. If Earth warned him about letting the little girl know about this new madness key, the one way to mess that up without saying it explicitly was suddenly being free of the scorned wraps. The pride madness key didn't seem happy about this, but it was surprisingly far more obedient. So, Silas asked it a question. Why can I not tell her about you? The path of the sin is corrupted and torn, filled and worn by jealousy. The path of virtue it originates from is superior in every way. Silas inwardly shook his head. It seemed he was back to vague answers. But the good news seemed to be that there were no taboos. He was effectively a perfect Tier 10 madness disciple the moment he got this pride madness key. However, he had a feeling that he understood nonetheless. Why would the madness paths lose 2 of their representative creatures, only to have them replaced by inferior beasts? Something wasn't adding up here. Then there was something else that bothered him. Pride is a virtue. Pride is the greatest virtue of all. A sin is only a sin in abundance, without control, without moderation. Everyone must eat. If you have no desire for anything, what is the purpose of your life? If you cannot feel fury, how can you feel happiness? If you cannot rest, how can you grow? If you do not procreate, where will the next generation come from? If you do not compare yourself to others, how can you adjust? If you feel no pride, then why exist? Chapter 1546 Almost. Scylla's gaze blazed when he saw these words. For him, it took no more than an instant to read them, and yet he went over them so many times that even the time dilation of his senses began to creep over into the real world, making it so that even his mother was looking at him in confusion, wondering why her son was in such a daze. Snapping out of it after a while, Silas could finally look at his mother again with the notification screen gone. I'm going to go stretch my legs out, Mother. I'll be back in a few hours. Isolde frowned. You just got back. I'll return soon, Silas reassured. With a step, he was already gone, the living room left with his family. Isolde looked over toward chaosheir. Is he really all right? Chaosheir beamed. I don't think he's ever been more all right. For some reason, Isolde trusted her daughter-in-law's words far more than her own son's. It was only then that she well and truly relaxed. The brat didn't even greet his own father, Cedric muttered. Blame yourself for getting here so late, Magnus said with a laugh. The old man, not quite so old anymore, could hardly hide the smile on his face. It was the same smile he had been wearing since Silas took over the Grimblade family, and he was hard-pressed to believe that it would be fading away any time soon. The oceans raged beneath Silas' feet. He crossed hundreds of kilometers at a time, moving across the world with such speed that it was almost not inconvenient at all that he had given up his world scepter. Before, Silas had had a treasure that allowed him to instantly teleport to any location on Earth. Unfortunately, he had needed to use it to save himself and make certain he came out on top during the last phase of the summoning. Now, he could only move across Earth the normal way. Without the twisting, winding portal locations, there was no way to use the ether plane to jump from continent to continent either. That was the drawback of saving Earth and setting things back to the way they should be. However, the Silas of now wasn't the Silas of the past. Setting aside the fact that he was a progenitor, his rune mastery and control over space alone spoke for themselves. He felt that he could get from anywhere to any other location on Earth within 60 minutes at most, just based on how accommodating Earth's runes were to allowing him to manipulate them. And, if he used the Hollow Wing. Raw, the rightful source is November 3 et. Sparkling motes of silver and black filled the skies. Hollow Wing, silver, sacred mount. Level, 51. Attribute, hollow. Plus 100% all stats. Limit, 1 million. Talents. Hollow Burst, Hollow Call, Hollow Claw, Hollow Bloom, Hollow Beam, Hollow Rend, Hollow Maw, Hollow Veil, Hollow Reversal, Hollow Domain. The Hollow Wing had completely unlocked all of its abilities, now all 10 of them. It seemed that the Hollow Wing was actually classified as a silver grade, something that Silas was only able to see recently. However, given the power of the Hollow Wing, and the fact it was classified as a sacred mount, it was clearly no normal silver grade. That was only made more clear by its new slew of abilities. Hollow Maw was technically a defensive technique. It formed a devouring veil that fused with the maw of the Hollow Wing. Much the same way it could cast Hollow Beam, it could do the reverse with Hollow Maw, shredding the integrity of attacks apart and devouring them. Hollow Veil was yet another defensive method. It allowed the Hollow Wing and its rider to become incorporeal for a fraction of a moment, making them impervious to any and all attacks, whether physical or ether-based. Though, there seemed to be an implied weakness to all-based attacks. Hollow Reversal was yet another defensive method. After so many attack and movement-type skills, it seemed the Hollow Wing's evolutionary path had backloaded these methods. With Hollow Reversal, the Hollow Wing didn't just avoid or eat attacks, it formed a reflective barrier that returned them at full force. Every one of these abilities was quite great, and if Silas directed them properly in battle, the end result would be quite spectacular. The fact the Hollow Wing had a limit of 1 million stat points was a bit low, though, in Silas' opinion. For a level 51, he would hope his combat mount would have at least double that. The plus 100% was nice, but still not good enough either. That said, Hollow Burst. Chi. In one moment, Silas and the Hollow Wing were rushing across the ocean. In the next, a crack appeared in space, a rotating black hole being left in their wake as they crossed time and space, appearing instantly over 500 kilometers away. At level 50, the Hollow Wing could instantly cross 50 kilometers. At level 51, that number increased by a factor of 10. 500 kilometers was a drop in the bucket to the ocean. But what if he used it again? Hibernation halo. A ring of gold appeared around Scylla's, and the hollow wing was immediately invigorated. In just a handful of seconds, its transparent wings flapped again. Hollow burst. Chi. They cut across the world again. Hibernation halo was less effective than the hibernation realm, but given how powerful Scylla's vipermancy profession was now, this difference was less meaningful. It would usually take the hollow wing a day, if not more, to recover. At best, it could use hollow burst twice a day. But beneath the effects of hibernation halo, a few seconds was enough. Chi. Hollow burst. Scylla saw the coastline on the other side. Almost there. The hollow wing roared into the skies, the Africa continent trembling beneath its might. There was probably no one on Earth with even a fraction of the stats of Scylla's, and the hollow wing doubled it. Its presence alone could cause cataclysms. But right about now, that was exactly what Scylla's needed. Before him lay the City of Glass. Chapter 1547 System-wide announcement. Scylla's eyes narrowed when he laid eyes on the city. It still hadn't been conquered, but he could practically smell the scent of death. He had been gone for a while, and the Grimblades didn't have enough people to possibly man the entire planet. The universe was so much larger, but sometimes Scylla's had to be reminded that he couldn't even really fathom the scope of an entire planet. Earth was enormous. Even with his strength, Scylla's needed time to get from place to place. Just the ocean he had crossed just now alone was over 6,000 kilometers wide, and that wasn't even a measure of its widest portion. The span around Earth itself left that number completely in its dust. That put things into perspective for him, and the feeling he had sinking in his gut when he laid eyes on the City of Glass likewise reminded him of just how small he was. His luck was still warning him of danger when he stood here. It was just a silver city. He was the strongest F-tier in the existence of the modern Milky Way sector. And yet, his luck was still warning him to be careful when facing its challenge. What if the City of Glass had been a gold city? What about a legendary one? Did he even have the right to think about the legendary city ticket he had in his pocket? Maybe he shouldn't be so flippant with the legendary city his Primus Imperium title had rewarded him with. He hadn't forgotten that he wanted to build a city in his hibernation realm. His Primus Imperium legendary city seemed like the perfect chance to do exactly that. But Scylla shook his head. He had already made his decision about that. It was important I have it. The fact it was tied to his Primus Imperium title was especially important because it would give the petals of the Seeing Thorn a vested interest in keeping him happy. Otherwise, they would lose their chance to benefit from a legendary city. If he wanted a city for his hibernation realm, he would need to get it himself. This was the price to pay for having to build up his background all on his own. He had no powerful parents to rely on or a great lineage he was willing to hand his safety over to. Even if he did, given his personality, he would undoubtedly hate to use it. This he would have to do on his own. Scylla's landed, putting the hollow wing away and looking up into the skies. No, he wasn't looking into the skies, but instead at the tall gates of icy blue transparent glass before him. On the ground here, they were so impossibly tall that it almost made him feel small. Almost. Scylla knew the real reason he still felt hints of danger. First, wherever this city would transport him, it wouldn't be on Earth any longer, meaning he would lose the rights to his progenitor status, which would have likely otherwise made this especially easy. Second, a city trial wasn't meant to be handled by one person. It was supposed to be handled by a leader of men, a person with armies at their beck and call. You were supposed to prove you were strong enough to lead the civilization that would be born from this city, and personal strength had little to do with that. It was the Grimblades as a whole that risked everything to get their hands on a bronze city stele back then. They used all sorts of treasures, methods, and their lives to give their future generations hope. Many had tried back then, but only the hidden families and continental governments had managed it. Now, Scylla wasn't just trying for a normal silver city stele, he was trying for a unique silver city, one not only with a special affinity but several unique amenities you couldn't find anywhere. It had to be remembered that Scylla had originally received the Glasserith in this city before he sacrificed it to create the hollow wing. The glassarith had been created by the unique glassrite taming profession of this city, a silver-grade profession that could be mass-produced within these city walls. Just because Scylla's had a few legendary professions didn't mean silver professions were just casually common. To put this matter into perspective, Scylla's had only run into a single person with a profession even close to his own. The sloth. In terms of professions themselves, most people didn't have one. In fact, Scylla's had in all likelihood never even run into anyone with a bronze profession. They were all mostly fragmented, ranked from F to FFF+. A silver profession that could be mass-produced was invaluable, and because it was tied to an amenity of the city, that meant that this profession was also easy to level up as well. Rather than having to go through life and death to upgrade this profession like Scylla's did, the city itself could directly do it in exchange for a small cost. And all of that was just a single benefit of this city. Scylla's looked down at his Pride Madness key. It shook with the same excitement the little girl had when she saw a gene to devour. Indeed, this was what the key meant by challenge. This, however, was no common challenge. But did it matter? Scylla's pressed a palm forward, and the gates of the city shook. The city of glass is dormant. Would you like to challenge for entry? Yes, no. Scylla's gaze flashed. Follow current S on novelfire.net. Yes. The instant he made his choice, he vanished. System-wide announcement. Progenitor Scylla's Grimblade has challenged a relic of the past. The City of Glass Warzone has been opened for viewing. Should he succeed, the remaining relics of Earth will likewise open. Cheer on the progenitor of your era. Everyone received the notification at once, including someone who had seemingly been long forgotten about. Moose looked up from his demonic throne, his eyes narrowing. Chapter 1548. A Relic of the Past. A relic of the past. Scylla saw the announcement much the same as everyone else. He wasn't exactly sure why the system felt it was necessary to tell everyone what he was up to. His mother was also going to scold him all the more when she realized that he had actually left their meeting for this. In reality, Scylla's had a good reason. He wanted to satisfy his Pride Madness key first, then relax a bit. From what he could tell, the Pride Madness key didn't actually seem to want to harm him, and there shouldn't be the same penalties for failure that the Greed Madness key had. That said, he also wanted to try and overfeed the Pride Madness key to see if it could cover the weaknesses he had exposed to the Gluttony Madness key. This aside, the implication in the words Relic of the Past seemed to imply that there was more than just the City of Glass. There were definitely other cities to conquer. This City of Glass in specific was just probably one of the more exposed ones. It was in the Africor continent, and with the death of the three monarchs, the region had become greatly destabilized. That scent of blood Scylla's had smelled was certainly others attempting to conquer the city and failing in his absence. He wasn't upset by this. In fact, he knew of a stronger city than the City of Glass. The City of Gold should be a gold city at the very worst, and Scylla's also knew exactly where it was. But he hadn't gone to challenge it, wanting to start here first to see what he was getting himself into. That said, this might be an opportunity, Scylla's thought. He was the progenitor of Earth, he was the reason everyone was alive and had succeeded in the summoning, but how many citizens of Earth actually knew that? Too few. It was only made worse by the fact there were so many traitors that the ones who could have had enough insider information to explain were mostly dead. If Earth projected this challenge every time someone attempted it, how many failures had the people of Earth already seen? Scylla's eyes cleared, and he found himself standing on a battlefield. Winds howled and hail pelted from above as heavy as falling arrows. They lashed out against his skin, threatening to draw blood. Scylla could imagine that most people of Earth would have died to the environment alone, either frozen or pelted to death. But then the army at a distance began to rise. Humanoids formed of blown glass riding on wolves and polar bears with fur spiked in white. All of their eyes glowed blue, shimmering with an oppressive chill and menace. Glass Warrior, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 50,100, mental, 75,100, will, 50,100. Glass Bear, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 75,100, mental, 50,100, will, 50,100. Glass Wolf, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 75,100. Mental, 50,100. Will, 50,100. Wave 1, time to wave 2, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. It was no wonder they all died. Those stats were already adjusted for the wider Milky Way sector. There was no one here with stats like this. Tears of the Beast Warlord Sanctum didn't even have stats like this. Earth needed to do a lot more evolving before it could produce people at the level of strength necessary to kill even one of these enemies of Wave 1, let alone fighting against so many of them. To Scylla's, though, they were nothing. Isolde almost fainted the moment she saw the notification. She had to be hurriedly stabilized by her husband, feeling as though the world was spinning around her. Scylla's was right. In the last year, there had been several teams that went to try and clear the City of Glass. Entire governments had made attempts, sending tens of thousands of people. Not a single one of them had made it past Wave 1. If the Afrikor Empire wasn't so unstable after the deaths of their monarchs, there would have been a huge blockade stopping anyone foolish enough to attempt it from doing so. Every relic of the past on Earth had practically become no different from a shiny cemetery. There was no escaping with your life. ssnovel-fire.net. Kasari blinked when she saw the pale faces of everyone around them. Even Alara had come back downstairs. The little girl's expression didn't scream worry, but she seemed to know it was best if she came here to be with everyone. What's going on? Kasari asked. Geraldine hesitated, not quite knowing what to say. But by now, Kasari had put 2 and 2 together on her own. She thought about telling them not to worry, but they had already tried that. Maybe it was just best if they saw for themselves. To the side, Magnus stood with his arms crossed as the projections began to play across Earth once again, his expression unreadable. The Celestial Republic. Kalian Starforge, Emperor of the Celestial Republic, didn't know what he had expected out of today, but hearing the name Silas Grimblade certainly wasn't among them. The Celestial Republic was one of the few powers that hadn't tried to betray Earth for the sake of outsiders back then, and it could be said that the young Kalian Starforge was among those that knew exactly what happened back then and had some great respect for Silas. Even so, when he saw this notification, his heart, too, sank. He stood from his throne, but he hadn't made it very far before a familiar Clipsian appeared before him. Sorenth Coralspire. You've seen it, Kalian said. I have. What do we do? Well, we can't really do anything about it now, can we? We can't afford to lose him like this. Why don't you go and tell him that? Sorenth said with a bitter laugh. They had no idea where Silas had been all this time. They had attempted to find him many times, but it was all for naught. Silas' family would have certainly told him about this, if not for the fact he had left just minutes after arriving for the first time in years. And now, here he was, throwing his life away. Chapter 1549 Kael Darkmane. When Silas left, he basically destroyed the United Alliance of Terra Nova and then crippled the Afrikor continent. The former he had done because they targeted his wife, and the latter he had done because they targeted him. As though that wasn't bad enough, during the last war to complete the summoning, the European Emperor had also been killed by one they speculated to be Silas. Though this wasn't true, the European Emperor had actually died at the hands of others. Silas would have certainly killed him if he came across him. The European Emperor was an arrogant, aggressive bastard who thought too highly of himself. Silas had never personally met him, but he had heard of his words through the grapevine. Archibald had once asked him not to kill him because Earth needed all the experts they could get. But as far as Silas was concerned, the only expert Earth needed was himself. Follow current S on novelfire.net. This was all to say that Silas was either directly or indirectly responsible for the crippling of 3 of Earth's greatest powers, and then he just up and disappeared for a year as though it had nothing to do with him. Then, when he finally came back after it all, not only did he not come back with any of the solutions for the disaster he had left in his wake, he was actually going to get himself killed basically the moment he returned. If Kalian wasn't used to the trials and tribulations of rule and the stress of everything being on his shoulders all the time, he would be pulling his hair out. The only silver lining to all of this was that the Clipsians were more powerful than ever before, ironically once again because of something Silas had done. After releasing the Clipsians from the captivity of the Sylphs, where else would they return if not Earth? In fact, it could be said that the strongest combatants of Earth right now were actually Nosphaline's father and the Clixians he led. It was just that since they were no longer overlords, they were highly limited in what they could do. In addition, because they were of the E tier, it didn't make sense to challenge the relics of the past either. Silas was facing F tier warriors only because he was F tier. If he was E tier, they would likewise be E tier. As such, Nosphaline's father and the others had never even made an attempt. But this good Silas had done didn't even remotely begin to make up for the bad. The Clixians weren't overlords, they couldn't progress. But the powerful combatants Silas had taken out were overlords. Who knew how well they could have progressed in this period? Earth was in such a blooming, promising state. There were opportunities around every corner, but there were also struggles. It just felt so frustrating. Silas was definitely a godsend for Earth. Without him, they would have failed the 9th and final summoning. Kalian knew this better than anyone else. But he was too arrogant and marched to the beat of his own drum too much. The pair of leaders could only look toward one another helplessly. Has there been movement? Kalian asked, wanting to distract himself from what he felt would ultimately be Silas' swift death. We are still deciphering the currents, but in another month or two, there's hope to succeed. If we can find the ancient grounds, we can baptize our people in the light of our ancestors. Though not certain, there's a chance we can regain our overlord status through this method. That could change everything. Kalian took a breath and exhaled. This would have to do. He had a feeling that something big was going to happen soon, but he had no idea exactly when. What he could have never guessed was that the ancient grounds they were looking for were precisely the underground statues Silas had long deciphered the location of and found. They wanted to use the Clixian statue to regain their overlord status and reverse what they had lost. But if Kalian knew this, he might truly begin to rip his hair out. If Silas knew, why didn't he just tell them? Soranth gasped. Kalian's eyes dimmed. What, is he dead already? Soranth didn't reply, slowly raising a finger and pointing. Ravenclaw Manor. The death of Ragnar Ravenclaw at the hands of Silas didn't actually cause that great of a fuss in the Ravenclaw Manor. From the very start, Thorn Ravenclaw and Draven Ravenclaw had been two of the far superior candidates. In fact, the Ravenclaws still had no idea that it was Silas who had done it. Because technically it wasn't. Silas had pushed Ragnar to the brink, but it was demons who did Ragnar in. What had really sent the Ravenclaws into a spiral and exacerbated the issue of Earth's lack of warriors was actually the death of their ancestors, people who were traitors to Earth. Even so, the foundation of the Ravenclaws was such that after Thorn took over as matriarch, they quickly stabilized. In Silas' absence, they had quietly established their Bronze City Stele and returned to being one of the strongest powers in the world. When Thorn saw that it was a Grimblade who was entering the City of Glass Trial, she was in abject shock. The Ravenclaws had been in deep seclusion and recovery for too long. Plus, Silas wasn't exactly a household name. Right now, it was Nathan who was actually managing many of the Grimblade matters. She instantly thought that it was maybe a rogue Grimblade trying to color outside of the lines and almost turned off the broadcast immediately. However, it was the possibility that the Grimblades were making a big play that kept her online. Just before what shocked the world happened, she received a call. It was a call from a person she could have never expected, one whose name she had had in the back of her mind for a long time, but had long tried to forget as she focused on the resurrection of her own family. A call from Chaol Darkmane. Chapter 1550 Resentment. Astrid Grimblade had been a great talent before her death. She managed to turn Malachi Grimblade, a talent in his own right, into a mere puppet, had used Silas to get rid of Lucius for her by avoiding taking him as her pick, and had almost killed Silas himself at one point. She was smart, sharp, and powerful. Clearly, she was head and shoulders above her competitors. And yet, no matter the ranking involved, whether it was the merit leaderboard, the leveling leaderboard, or the city leaderboards, there was one person who was consistently ahead of her no matter what she did. Chaol Darkmane. The Darkmanes were the most low-key of the three hidden families, and the only one of them that Silas had never personally come across. Though, their ancestors had likewise died under the system's fury. Much like Chaol had always been first with the exception of leaderboards Silas had been on, the Darkmanes had likewise only ever had two candidates to the three of the other families. Chaol and Asher alone were the pillars of the family, and they were too easily overlooked because of this. At least by the public. When it came to those who understood this family, they didn't just not overlook them. They had a healthy fear of them. Astrid had personally been extremely wary of Chaol. He was a man who had limits she couldn't see through, and maybe because she was far more familiar with Chaol than she had ever been with Scylla's, she had always subconsciously treated Chaol as far more of a threat. When Thorn realized it was this man attempting to establish a line of communication with her, she almost forgot that she was supposed to be watching what was happening with Scylla's. Her entire world froze until she slowly picked up. Thorn Ravenclaw. The voice was deep, gruff, and abyssal in ways she couldn't describe. It simply didn't feel human in the way that it should, almost like someone had blended the most harrowing voices they could find in a program to spit this one out. The name he spoke was her own, and it should have been a question, but it simply didn't feel like one. Thorn calmed herself. Chaol Darkmane. I'm calling you about the City of Glass. I plan to take the Darkmanes to the Grimblades as a show of allegiance soon, and I would hope that you would come with me. Thorn's eyes opened wide. What did you say? Chaol didn't repeat himself. He let Thorn sit with the words, almost as though every one he spoke was too precious. Why repeat something he didn't have to? Thorn took a deep breath. Why? The gap is too large, he said simply before ending the communication. Thorn didn't understand what she was hearing. What did he mean the gap was too large? Her head snapped back up to the screen only to see what everyone else was seeing play out. Her eyes opened so wide it felt like they were falling out of their sockets. Professor Fembroise had been in the custody of Castlemaine for a long while now. Her son and husband had been allowed to be with her, but even now, she was under strict supervision. Much of her previous anger had taken a strong downturn after the government responsible for it all had been wiped out due to Scylla's needing training targets for chaosheir. But even so, it was hard for a mother to forget the loss of her son. She still had one child left, and what she thought was strength, but she was helpless to use it. Not when Scylla's of all people didn't trust her. She was lucky to have her life alone, and the only reason she had it at all was because the system wanted to preserve her life for reasons even she didn't fully understand. When she saw the name Scylla's Grimblade in the notification, she couldn't help but feel a swirl of complex emotions. She had always known Scylla's to be polite, though guarded, while also being professional and sharp. Plus, he was the man who had saved her from being raped, something she would forever be grateful for. She had held some resentment, but the more she sat with those emotions, the more she understood Scylla's perspective. If the roles had been reversed, she wouldn't have been as decisive as Scylla's, but she would have certainly thought about it. Much like everyone else, she turned to the broadcast simply feeling curious, and a bit worried. How many people had she seen die to this exact challenge in the last year? It felt like there was a new fool every month. But then it began. Scylla's took a step forward, his posture casual. He wore a snow-white turtleneck that almost blended into the howling hail, a pair of pressed black dress pants for his bottoms. There wasn't a single treasure in sight on him. No blade, no armor, no support. He just stood there as though he had entered for no reason other than to end his own life. When the first attacks fired, a rain of arrows, cannons of iced ether, it truly did seem. As though there was no path forward outside of death itself. But then his eyes flashed. A transparent barrier of golden green appeared around Scylla's in a semi-spherical dome. Official source is november.egravefire.net. Peng, peng, peng. Scylla slowly pulled a hand out of a pocket, raising a finger. The arrows that rebounded off his shield spiraled wildly in all directions, so random and hard to track that it should have been impossible for a single person to grasp the trajectory of them all. And yet Scylla's did. Then, slowly, the waves of arrows in the air came to a stop in layers, first the ones closest and then the ones further away until they formed a pack in the skies so dense it cast a shadow that blotted out the sun before Scylla's. With a sound akin to flipping paper, they all spun in the air, turning to face the army. Scylla's only simply pointed, a casual action without much effort or fanfare, yet death descended. The sound of pelting rain fell from above, so continuous and unrelenting it shook the world. When the dust cleared, there was no army remaining. Scylla stood alone. Chapter 1551 Nails. What would it feel like if a world took a collective breath? What about if the entire world stopped breathing at the same time? How many times had they watched this first round play out? How many times had they seen armies of tens of thousands completely wiped out in a matter of seconds? The population of Earth had already taken an enormous dip. Due to the trial, they lost vast swaths of the male population. In an instant, over half the men on Earth sentenced themselves to death just by clicking yes. Women were luckier in this aspect, or at least more tempered with their actions. And yet, the Earth still lost over 30% of them in what felt like a flashing instant. In that instant, no matter what happened, no matter what changed, the Earth lost half of its population. But the trial had just been the beginning. After this, they dealt with dungeons and portals, with monsters flooding cities and their homes being wiped out. Over just the first few weeks of the summoning post-trial, Earth's population fell to less than 10% of what it had originally been. From a population of over 10 billion people, they had less than a billion left. And of that billion, the number that had no choice but to rely on the protection of powers and governments around them was another more than 90%. On the entire planet now, there were barely a million people, if that, with stats they deemed great enough to even hope to join an army and challenge the City of Glass. Tens of thousands of these men and women, bold warriors with FFF plus monikers, layered in treasures of all kinds that Silas himself couldn't even wear, had come here to throw their lives away. Maybe their strengths alone didn't mean much to Silas, but a world with as much talent as Earth, growing toward the higher silver grades even right this moment, had so many resources to produce. So many special professions and classes, so many shocking legendary path treasures prepped and ready. None of these people who made these attempts could be considered stupid. They had survived for so long in this post-apocalyptic world after their lives had been upended beneath them. And yet, not a single one had managed to survive the first wave of attacks, let alone the first wave itself. Then there was Silas. Pressed black dress pants, a white turtleneck formed of soft fabric that tightly bound to his broad shoulders, even a pair of white loafers that almost blended into the snow beneath him. He was the picture of a classy businessman, maybe on a summer vacation to his cottage. The only thing slightly out of line about him was just how wild his hair was, dancing with a sharp sporadicness in the chilly, cold air. He had only raised a finger, just one. He hadn't moved an inch. And yet a notification projected to the world made them realize that what they were seeing wasn't an illusion at all. Wave 1 cleared. Wave 2. Commencing in 0 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds. You should take a look. Isolde slowly peeked her eyes open when chaosheir spoke. They had been squeezed so tight the ligaments that held her lids together strained, pulsing with what almost felt like a cramp. It took her all the courage in the world to open her eyes. If not for the trust she had in chaosheir after watching this little girl grow up from a swaddle to a fine young lady, she might not have opened them up at all. And that was when she saw it. The image of her son the rest of the world also saw. Kalian blinked once, then twice. If not for his status as an emperor, he might have rubbed his eyes as well for double measure. This didn't make any sense. Watching Silas do this was the equivalent of pre-summoning citizens watching a colleague catch a nuke in the palm of their hands. The gap was impossible to fathom. How could one person be so impossibly powerful? Kalian exhaled out what was almost a laugh. He couldn't believe it. Where the hell did this monster come from? Follow current novels on novel_free.net. Moose slowly rose to his feet, his gaze impossibly grave. There was a heaviness between his brows as he looked back to the demonic world. This wasn't good. This wasn't good at all. Silas knew of his existence. Moose's name had appeared on the rankings of the Battle of Worlds. If it was up to Silas, Moose would already be dead. It didn't take a genius to know how he would react if he knew Moose was still here. If Silas still had the world's scepter, he would have certainly already stepped here to check the state of the portal to the demon world. But now that he was back, Moose had a feeling that Silas was doing this on purpose. Maybe he originally just planned to take the City of Glass quietly. But after realizing that this would be broadcast to the whole of Earth, he was taking this as an opportunity to prove a point. How long would it take to go to every power one by one and establish dominance? How long would it take to make these large numbers of prideful men and women bend the knee? But now, Silas had only raised a finger, and Moose could practically feel it. The world bowing to him. Your emotions are in flux. The voice of a woman echoed. The tone, the cadence, the sultry silkiness of it all was so elegant and seductive it could instantly bring even women to their knees, let alone men. Moose, himself, tensed when he heard this. It's not going to work, he said after a long while. The voice didn't reply, but soon a look of pain began to appear on Moose's face. There was no one there, but what looked like nails scraping across his skin and peeling it up appeared on his back. Chapter 1552 What chance? Moose grit his teeth, his jaw rattling with the pain, but his voice remained completely silent. You've failed me many times, my love, haven't you? First, you failed to secure progenitor status. Then, you sit around for a year and still fail to snatch it back. Now you tell me that everything we've planned won't work. Do you know what this sounds like to me? The excuses of a man who doesn't believe in his goddess. That's a problem, don't you think? What should I do with an unworthy concubine? See for yourself. Moose's words came out steady despite his pain, his large frame solidifying as he allowed a window to his eyes. The voice fell to silence. Chaol Darkmane sat in silence. He had a jaw that looked as though it had been chiseled out of stone. His skin was darker than most on the homogenized Earth. After the 8th summoning, Earth had done its best to intermingle the gene pool of everyone, making most quite racially ambiguous to those of the past. But Chaol seemed as though he had spent quite a long period of time in the sun, his skin bronzed and his eyes radiating a sharp golden light. The man was built like a brick wall, standing at what had to be almost 8 feet tall now, and laying a cudgel with a particularly long polearm across his lap. His reaction wasn't like the others. The moment he had seen Silas, he knew. He made the phone call long before Silas had even acted. In fact, he made the phone call the instant he had seen the notification, before even laying eyes on the man. In fact, Chaol knew this would happen long ago when no one could find Silas. This was most definitely the benefit of stepping off of Earth. Earth was great because of its summoned status. It had dungeons the world had never heard of, sprouted up resources that even the Sanctum would salivate over, and there was an overwhelming amount of ether here just for the lot of them. However, it had its limitations as well. The difficulty of the challenges that appeared here was scaled to its people. Earth was trying to train them to be better, but too much of their population was still far too weak. This was like an anchor dragging them all down. Because of this, the dungeons could only grow so powerful, the quick-time events only became so intensive. Chaol hadn't stepped out of the Darkmane compound in over a month because there was simply nothing worth doing with his strength. Instead, he had poured all of his resources into trying to find a way to leave the planet. But he wasn't Earth's progenitor, and he couldn't as easily leave its influence. So he was stuck here. He was so used to being number one in everything he did. But this time, he had lost and so thoroughly at that. Slowly, he stood as the world rocked to a stop around him. His flying vessel touched down, right outside of Castlemaine territory. Silas looked at the ticking timer. Interesting. This wasn't the first time he had challenged a city stele. It was just that the first time was for a bronze city, and it was in different circumstances during the Battle of Worlds. Back then, there had been demon coins, named waves, and much more time to rest. But this had none of that. This was a real city stele trial. He wouldn't be able to buy treasures to help him here, nor would he have time to rest. In fact, the only way out of here was victory or death. If he went over the 24-hour time limit, the next wave would appear, and if he went over it again, the next would appear. There was no stalling, no rest, just endless, wall-to-wall battle until only a single army was left standing. Or a single man. Glass Warrior, FFF+. Level, 50. Physical, 75,100. Mental, 100,100. Will, 75,100. Glass Bear, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 100,100. Mental, 75,100. Will, 75,100. Glass Wolf, FFF+. Level, 50. Physical, 100,100. Mental, 75,100. Will, 75,100. Wave 2, time to Wave 3, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. An identical wave to the first appeared. But their stats had already increased by leaps and bounds. Is this really a Silver City Stele? There should be 10 waves. At wave 2 alone, they were already nearing half of Scylla's physical stats. From his experience, Scylla also knew that they would become more difficult to deal with in more ways than just their stats alone. They would gain formations, treasures, better teamwork, higher intellect. At this pace of improvement, Scylla was fairly certain that the challenge would scale far greater than what he had experienced in the Tower of Champions. Interesting. He raised another finger. Wave 2 cleared. Wave 3, commencing in 0 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds. He raised his finger once again. Wave 3 cleared. Wave 4, commencing in 0 hours 0 minutes and 59 seconds. Scylla exhaled a breath, his expression growing more focused. Wiping out Wave 3 wasn't nearly as easy as Waves 1 and 2. The army was already nearing his physical stats. It seemed that now, he would have to grow more serious. Glass Warrior, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 150,100. Mental, 220,100. Will, 150,100. Glass Bear, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 220,100. Mental, 150,100. Will, 150,100. Glass Wolf, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 220,100. Mental, 150,100, Velfire.net. Will, 150,100. Wave 4. Time to Wave 5, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Scylla's finger raised into the skies, runes beginning to wildly swirl. Glass Ether bowed. To his momentum, the army before him finding themselves stripped of their energy. His morphic silver bearings appeared, forming sheets of continuous curved shields in the air as the momentum of his will manifestation bloomed. He pressed his finger down, a ripple spreading through the world. Chi, chi, chi. Arrows of will twisted until they became solid streaks of icy blue cutting across the air. The result was much the same. Scylla's was used to fighting those with stats greater than his own. What chance did those with weaker stats than him stand? Chapter 1553 Relentless. Glass Warrior, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 220,100, mental, 250,100, will, 220,100. Glass Bear, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 250,100, mental, 220,100, will, 220,100. Glass Wolf, FFF+, level, 50. Physical, 250,100, mental, 220,100, will, 220,100. Wave 5, time to Wave 6, 0 hours 23 minutes and 59 seconds, 59. Scylla lowered his hand, staring out at the army. He realized the moment the second wave appeared that it wasn't just the strength of these enemies increasing, but their numbers as well. It almost felt somewhat ridiculous. The first wave had about 10,000 or so enemies. Every wave since had added an additional 10,000, the strength of the combined attacks they were using increasing. But this wave, on top of having 50,000 spawned enemies, had something new to it. Glass Commander, FFF+. Level, 50. Physical, 220,100. Mental, 250,100. Will, 400,100. Seeing the will, Scylla's eyes narrowed. This shouldn't have been a surprise. The path of glass wasn't just a combination of poison and ice. Deeper within was a clash between ruling styles, a king that held their subjects in the highest regard, or an emperor that fought battles for themselves. The clash of the two was, in reality, a unique form of will. The fact that the waves had had poor will abilities until now was a question hovering at the back of Scylla's mind, only for it to suddenly appear like this. The moment Scylla raised a finger to cast his waves of telekinetic attacks again, he felt the pressure of a glass commander crash into him. It rebounded away, nearly shattering on impact. He watched as the glass commander stumbled back. However, Just as Silas was about to take advantage, another glass commander acted, bombarding him much the same way, and then another. For the army of 50,000, there were 100 of them, each one commanding a group of 500 men. All of a sudden, Silas' domain was being impugned upon. A single glass commander was a child before him. 500 of them, all attacking his will at the same time. That was a different matter entirely. The air shook and a formation bloomed in the skies, connecting the wills of the 500 glass commanders. This seemed to be an end-phase ability they planned to use, but after 2 of them had nearly been crippled by Silas the moment the battle began, they activated it immediately. And by this time, the first wave of attacks had already been launched. Everything happened so fast that Silas was swallowed whole without defenses for the first time. Runes swirled to life around Silas, and he appeared high in the skies, his gaze sharp and focused. This was the first time in the battle that he had been forced to move. Even he didn't expect the difficulty of a mere Silver City trial to scale so quickly. Though, once again, he knew that this wasn't just a normal Silver City stele, but instead a unique one that had already been upgraded to the town level. The fact it was enough to make him serious so quickly was truly something else. Silas took a breath and exhaled. The last thoughts he had of this ending easily went out the window. He had known that things would end like this the moment he felt a ping from his luck, but thinking it and seeing how it played out were 2 different matters. Even so, this was no longer about just winning for Silas. It was just as the others thought. Since this battle was being projected to the whole of Earth, he was going to use it to make a point. He didn't have time for traitors. He didn't have time to be stabbed in the back. He didn't have the time to babysit or become a sheep herder. When he spoke, when he commanded, when he gave orders, the people of Earth should listen. After today, he would have given them enough forewarning. Should they cross him, they should expect death. Silas' other hand was slowly removed from his pocket as he rolled up his sleeves. His morphic silver bearings formed a large silver surfboard beneath his feet as he kicked his shoes off. Soon, his telekinesis had even rolled up his dress pants. Shuu. In a flash, he disappeared from the skies, the surfboard roaring to life beneath him. Boom, boom, boom. The surge of attacks collapsed in the skies behind him as Silas mowed down the first line of glass warriors and beasts. Boom. NW novel chapters are published on novelfire.net. Silas' silver surfboard buried itself into the ground as his feet stepped onto the soft snow. He appeared before a glass commander, his claw streaking through the skies and grabbing it by the face. The chill threatened to freeze him to death, a wool shield forming over the latter's body as its warriors tried to surround Silas. Chi. It was useless. The shield crumbled to ash, Silas' claws dancing with darkness as he activated Chaotic Menace. His chaotic space ether roared and tore into the man's skull, ripping it to shreds. The formation lost a pillar and the pressure on Silas and his will almost collapsed before stabilizing itself once again. But in that brief collapse, Silas took control of the runes around him, flickering and vanishing in the twisting slopes of space to appear before the next glass commander. Silas was a rampaging demon, his posture almost casual. Every action came with a practiced ease, as though he could account for thousands of variables at once. Relentless, he shredded apart enemy after enemy with his bare hands. His fists carried the weight of mountains, and when his kicks ascended and cut, it felt like the skies were falling. Snowy hills were formed and collapsed in breaths of time, fists ripping through metal and flesh alike as though each of the latter 2 were little more than fine meshes of paper. Silas' palms slapped the sides of a glass commander's head, grinding its skull into a fleshy paste that crumbled into sparkling motes of ice and water. Chapter 1554 Lit Path. Wave 5 cleared. Silas stood amidst the carnage, his breathing steady and even. If not for the heated steam coming from his nostrils, one would have never guessed that he had undergone a bout of physical exertion at all. He looked down at his hands as the 60-second timer wound down. Not good enough. He felt like there was more to gain, more to unearth, to pull out of himself. But Silas also felt that he was quickly running to his limits as well. There was no way he could progress to an S-grade race. The gap was too large. There was still so much runway within the bounds of an A-grade race, but he had no idea how to unearth that potential either. He didn't have impurities to worry about. He had been lucky enough to expunge those. His foundation was already as perfect as it could be for an F tier. So why did he feel so lacking? He had experienced what it felt like to draw legendary genes. With a wave of his hand, he could change the life of anyone in the world. It was practically the power of a god, and it had only taken him 2 years to achieve it, of which he had only personally experienced less than a year. Silas looked up. The army of the sixth wave began to form. But this time, he was barely 5 meters from their front line instead of kilometers away. He stood there, unmoved by their spawning, and as each new orb of blue became an equally new pair of piercing eyes, the chill in the air increased and descended with greater menace. He could feel all of the city of glass manifesting into a stronger and more tangible form. Is that what I'm missing? Something so clear, so direct. A Tao. Spacetime Tao seed. Ancient treasure. Silas had been studying the tree that sprouted from his spacetime Tao seed for a long while now. In fact, it was because of it that he had been able to successfully craft his personal path of rune mastery, making him the primus luminaria of the Milky Way sector. Could it be that this was what he was missing for his foundation as well? But even that just felt like the beginning. He had a so-called perfect spark seed within him, but it was still called a seed, and he still felt like he had vast pathways left to explore in rune mastery. Could they not both be used for the same thing? TSOURC of THS Content S novel Fire Net. Pride. The answer came to Silas as fluidly as flowing rain. It was what his foundation was missing. A guiding light in the darkness, something to anchor it and give it strength. He had so many abilities, so many paths, so many bits and pieces of unearthed potential he had yet to use. He had 2 classes, 100 foundation ethers, 3 comprehensions, 3 professions, countless skills, unused gene talents, an unexplained race, and even more baffling family lineage on top of all of that. What they needed was a guiding principle. A Tao just like in the ancient times. And for Silas, such a thing was impossibly easy. So easy that he only had to think it. His understanding of himself had reached perfection within the F tier. Maybe in the future he could still change, or maybe there were deeper layers of self only higher level beings could ever truly grasp. Or maybe you would never truly, well and completely, understand yourself and could only continue to strive for it. But the answers to these questions didn't matter for now. What did matter was that he, Silas Grimblade, had already reached a state of perfection within the F tier. If he couldn't afford to embroil his family in a war for demigodhood with his current strength, and reaching the S grade wasn't in the cards for now, then that could only mean that it was time. The rings of gold around Silas' eyes glowed bright and forceful. At the same time, his green gold wool solidified into a band around his forehead. Silas' wool bloomed. The glass commanders of the sixth wave tried to act. All of them, all 1,000 of them shattered in the same instant of time, falling into a rain of chunks of ice. Broken, beaten, and forgotten. Silas reached out a hand. The 9 balls of morphic silver bearings rose into the skies. They doubled in size, and then doubled again, doubling once more on top of that. Soon, they had grown to the size of mountains, not weighing nearly as heavy, but the difference hardly mattered at all. With a clench of Silas' fists, they fell from above like meteors. Boom, 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 boom. The world shook, what formations the glass army tried to form or create falling by the wayside. It was a tragedy the likes of which had never been seen before, a scope of destruction the people of Earth had once only been able to fathom by their understanding of nukes. Yet, this power was in the hands of a single man, and worse yet, he stood amidst the destruction. As waves of snow and shattered Earth fell toward him, it was like he had nothing to do with the devastation at all. Silent and unbothered, he stood there, confident that not a single flake would touch his clothing. And when it all settled down, he couldn't have been more correct. The Earth was left in tatters. Runes quickly tried to reform it as the timer ticked down toward 0 seconds for the appearance of the 7th wave, and yet, for the first time, the world was seeing the fallibility of the system. No matter how quickly it worked, or how great it rushed, there was nothing it would be able to do. When the timer hit 0, the glass army was spawned into a valley. They could only look up toward Silas, who stood above them like a god amongst men. Silas raised a finger, and the earth around the valley trembled, burying them within. Chapter 1555, Boom. 1. Seas of earth crumbled down the walls of the valley. Boulders of ice, avalanches of snow, a chill that descended as whatever little heat there was rose. It was destruction the likes of which could level cities, the sort of power a single man shouldn't have had any business having. The people of Earth that had never leveled up, people who remained safe only because they had governments and powers protecting them from the dangers that had appeared in a world so very unfamiliar to them now, could only imagine that Scylla's had long transcended the F tier. In fact, even some who were surpassing level 40, approaching the limits of the F tier and prepping for what it might be like to be a level 51, believed the same. Scylla's was far too powerful. That said, the intelligent among them noticed something odd immediately. The challenge of the City of Glass was tailored to their tier. Those that had entered had been crushed by a power that felt no less overwhelming to them. This was proof that it was possible for an F tier to have this level of strength. What felt incredulous was that a single F tier could possibly wipe out an army of tens of thousands all on his own. Scylla's had only acted personally once. The rest of the time, he played with the runes of the trial world as though they were the strings of his harp, orchestrating the music of the universe with the casual control of not a man, but a god. Bang! Scylla suddenly punched out, his fist meeting a large one that plowed out of the destruction of the valley below. He took a single step back, his gaze much the same as he stabilized himself with a shake of his wrist. A ripple of air shot outward from the meshed point of their knuckles, a warrior that looked far more real than any of the others, landing heavily on the edge of the valley's cliff. A frost giant with rings of gold around its wrists and ankles stood, towering at twice Scylla's height. Wild facial hair formed of icicles hung from its jawline, its actual head being a shimmering shade of bald. Glass giant, FFF+, level, 50, physical, 370,100, mental, 300,100, will, 370,100. Scylla's looked down at the skin of his fist, feeling that it was a little hot and a little red from the impact. With a thought, his scorned wraps phased back into reality, chains rattling around them. The glass giant was already upon him again, and Scylla's mind flashed toward a single thought. Overwhelming victory. He pulled on his comprehension, mixed demonic arts flooding his mind as everything slowed around him. One skill after another reached perfection, and his body became an unbridled war machine. The glass giant kicked at him, but Scylla's had already ducked forward, his palm slamming into the ground. He timed his one-armed cartwheel so perfectly that the large leg of the glass giant missed ahead. Bang! Scylla's heel slammed right into the crotch of the frost giant, the arc of his foot flashing so fast it left trails of howling wind in its wake. Bang! Scylla's completed his cartwheel, the sole of his foot ending on the lower half of the giant's torso with a shuddering cacophony that shattered the cliff face of the valley. Blood spurted from the giant's lips, a heavy telekinesis making it feel as though the weight of mountains was pressing down upon it. This was the difference between real challenges and the kind spawned by the system. The stats that Scylla's read from day-to-day people were little more than starting points. They still had comprehensions, skills, various gene talents and professions to worry about, and that was all before you considered the elephant in the room. The treasures that supported them. But when the system gave you a list of stats to read off, they were practically a sure representation of the threat you were facing. There would be some exceptions, and some caveats. But in a one-on-one battle like this, there were no surprises. The stats of this glass giant weren't even better than the King Serpent's. And Scylla's had defeated it before he even had a full slate of legendary genes to shore up his foundation. What chance did this giant stand if Scylla's was hell-bent on not just defeating it, but crushing it? Scylla's raised a hand, and his morphic silver bearings shot up from the valley below, shrinking into cuffs and links that slammed into the wrists, ankles, and neck of the glass giant. With a squeeze of his hand, they tightened as Scylla's raised a finger of his other hand. Glassvolt Prism Arts. A large lance of raging emerald gold lightning formed in an instant, growing larger and larger until Chi. The runes within condensed by just 5%. That 5% change somehow forced the lance into the shape of a slim needle, so small that if not for the radiant light it was exuding, it wouldn't be noticeable to the naked eye of a mortal at all. Chi. It zipped forward, ripping right through the head of the glass giant. Bang! The body of the creature convulsed, and then its skull imploded, a wave of destruction rushing out of it from the inside out. Wave 7 cleared. Silas saw the notification, but his actions were almost like he hadn't. His morphic silver bearings were still moving, bearing down on the body of the glass giant until its enormous frame became little more than a mangled mesh of concentrated flesh. By the time it was finished, the 8th wave had already begun to form on the jagged remains of the valley. Because Silas had collapsed it, the valley was no longer nearly as deep, and there wasn't room to repeat the same process. Instead, he found himself face to face with yet another army. And much the same, his expression didn't so much as change. Instead, he just casually lobbed a ball of flesh at them. Boom. Chapter 1556, Boom. The explosion blew even Silas back. He formed shields with his morphic silver bearings, his will forming one layer of protection after another. Deep in his eyes, however, he was finally showing the slightest hint of something more than just indifference. It was one part intrigue, and another part shock. One of the most powerful abilities of spatial casting was his ability to squeeze runes into smaller forms. This allowed far weaker runes to display power impossibly beyond themselves. Since then, Silas' spatial casting had evolved into his self-created Archon casting, and he could easily replicate these same things but to an even greater extent. How much he could squeeze runes was highly limited, and though still limited through Archon casting, it wasn't nearly as much. Silas felt that even reducing the size of an F-grade rune by 20% was possible. This didn't sound like much, but the instability of a rune on that level meant that if Silas succeeded in guiding it toward completion, it wouldn't just be a matter of doubling its strength. There would be a difference of orders of magnitude. He could probably make a 10 foundation rune display the strength of a 100 foundation rune with this approach. But there was a problem with all of this. Silas could do this for a long while now, but he hardly ever used this ability in battle. So what was the catch? The catch was that the difficulty in doing so for larger runes was too high. Even Silas, and even with Archon casting, had to limit himself to runes at and below 10 foundations. And, when the rune destabilized, the only one to suffer backlash from it was Silas himself, because a rune was tied to the will of a rune master before it was fully imprinted onto the world. It wouldn't become independent until the casting was successful. Before Silas had Archon casting, it was especially not worthwhile. That was because the result of spatial casting back then would only be a rune with the strength of around 70 foundations or so. Silas could draw such a rune with his eyes closed and his hands tied behind his back. Why even bother to risk using spatial casting at that point? And even when he got Archon casting, he could now easily draw 100 foundation runes, so why risk it anyway? The only catch was that he didn't have many 100 foundation runes that he knew, so it could still come in handy for the time being. The only method through which Silas had found to use this form of spatial casting effectively was by targeting the treasures of his enemies. Because treasures already had their own self-sustained runes, if Silas could comprehend them mid-battle, take control of them with his will, and then forcefully shrink them, he could make the weapons of his enemies self-destruct. In fact, if he was desperate enough, there was nothing stopping him from doing this with his own treasures as well. The self-destruction was quite good. But even this was pretty limited in effectiveness. This ability only worked best when he was targeting E-grade treasures with some F-grade runes he could exploit. The self-destruction of a mere F-grade weapon wouldn't kill anyone Silas couldn't already easily kill himself. So unless Silas walked around with an arsenal of legendary grade F-grade treasures like the ones he had given chaosheir for a rainy day, self-destructing weapons was mostly a waste of his time as well. And if he was up against an F-tier warrior that he needed something like that against, like Orthrian, for example, the latter's will was so powerful that there wasn't a chance for Silas to take advantage in the first place. This form of spatial casting felt like it had so much potential, and yet there were so many roadblocks. And yet, Wave 8 cleared. A single glass giant destroyed the entire 8th wave for Silas. Silas slid to a stop, his feet leaving deep trenches in the ice and snow. The heat wave that radiated out from the destruction was so great that even the relentless hail from above was melted away, falling in rain droplets instead, much of which was simply left in sizzling piles of steam before they could even reach the earth. All Silas had done was take control of all the runes in the giant's body that he could manage to, using extricate as a bridge to sensing and feeling them out. Because of his glassfold poison ether, he crushed all the will within the giant's body, not to mention the fact it was now completely dead and technically had no ancestors. Then he squeezed, shrinking all of the runes he could by 10% in a single go. Silas had only been casually testing it out, not expecting too much. If it took out a few hundred, it would be a decent enough strategy to use from time to time. But this. Even he wasn't expecting this. Logically, he knew it was because of a very specific set of circumstances. In the real world, if he wanted to take control of the genes of a person with stats as great as the glass giants, he would need to deal with the hurdle of gene locks and probably their ancestors' wills within their bodies as well. But Silas suddenly realized that he had stumbled onto quite the shocking ability. There was maybe nothing in the entire universe with as much latent potential as a living being. The destruction a self-destruction could cause was simply catastrophic. Silas had no idea that there were special techniques designed to do exactly this at the moment of birth. But he had just created one that was on the level of the very best. In fact, it might very well be the strongest self-destruction technique in the entire universe. Casually formed from a bit of experimentation, being the product of several legendary professions matched with the touch of a primus luminaria. Silas looked up at the ninth wave finally fully formed. He had already been quite fond of using people-like weapons to claim victory. This was just another step forward. This concludes the chapters. Show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribe.